Free characters in gacha games can be pretty hit or miss depending on the game. In some, you'll find the initial starting lineup to be discarded at the earliest opportunity, typically when you start pulling for characters, while in others, they'll end up having a stable presence on your team. In light of the revenue model of gachas mostly coming in the form of pulls, from a profitability standpoint, it's not in their best interest to make free characters the best in the game, so as to give you an actual incentive to pull for more. But to accommodate the expanded target audience following the gacha boom in 2020, these days it's become more commonplace for the main character and/or tutorial units to be at the very least average or above average in relation to the cast. They're noticeably relevant in the metagame even long after joining your team, either in the base form or through later transformations or something to that effect, which you can notice in other mainstream gachas like Zenless Zone Zero, Wuthering Waves, and especially Honkai Star Rail. While a gacha is of course permitted to make you pull for new units, it should at the very least give you something to work with in case you don't have the wherewithal to get a bunch of characters quickly. And for the most part, units like Nicole, Rover, Trailblazer to name a few cover enough bases for you to at least get your feet off the ground. By comparison, Genshin Impact's tutorial lineup, more specifically the Traveler, has been noted for being measurably weaker in practical usage. Despite having now 6 different iterations, only 1 or 2 of them perform at, generously speaking, an average level, while the others are so ineffective in relation to other characters that they rank at the very bottom of the cast. One of the first Why No One Plays videos I made was on the Traveler, which at the time was in reference to Anemo, Geo, and Electro Traveler. Since then, we've gotten 3 more elements, Dendro, Hydro, and the new Pyro. With 6 elements now at their disposal, one would think they'd turn things around at this point, but following the disastrous reception of Hydro Traveler and tepid enthusiasm towards Pyro, I wanted to make a follow-up episode on them. Still not sure whether to make this a Why No One Plays Part 2 or more of a standalone thought piece on them yet, but regardless, today we'll be discussing the disappointment that is Aether and Lumine, all 6 versions of them. So the performance of Traveler was collectively underwhelming even from the get-go. Back when there was only Anemo and Geo Traveler, neither of them really made a strong case to be played, in spite of the relatively limited roster we had at the time. For example, Sucrose and especially Venti practically overshadowed Anemo Traveler on release, and to this day, Anemo MC is considered the worst Anemo character. Palm Vortex was designed to draw enemies in and deal a burst of damage, but the time it took to charge it up all the way, and the relatively short attack radius made it too slow and inefficient to deal any meaningful damage. Gust Surge may have appeared to be a useful tool in crowd-controlling enemies, but the fact that it counterproductively pushed enemies away from you, forcing you to waste time chasing after them, made Anemo Traveler overall a lot worse than Sucrose, Venti, and even Jean. There was a silver lining in Constellation 6 wherein they could apply an additional shred onto enemies based on elemental absorption to compound on top of Virtus and Venerer, but it was still far from adequate in justifying usage of them over other options. This sentiment would carry on over to Geo Traveler. Geo Traveler by comparison actually saw some niche usage, mostly because they did a good bit of damage and had some supportive utility, namely in the form of C1 giving 10% bonus crit rate and some armor. But at the time, the only options we had for Geo were pretty trash outside of Zhongli, who himself was more of a general support than an actual Geo one. Apart from a brief stint in mono Geo teams, the Geo element was neglected for years, and by the time it came back into relevance, it began to push away from mono Geo and Geo constructs, losing what little relevance Geo MC had left. The Traveler's first 2 elements were both painfully mediocre even by the standards of version 1, so you can imagine how they stack up against Kazuha, Chaska, Xianyun, Vars on Shell, and Zhongli, Navia, Shilon, and Shiori respectively. Electro Travelers where players began to see some hope, albeit a very faint spark. While they were by no means anywhere close to official or Beidou relevance, the supportive utility they offered, very unique supportive utility I might add, gave them a worthwhile argument to be used. Battery was one of the central themes of Electro, and both their skill and burst helped accelerate your party's overall rate of burst usage. The problem is, while Traveler could facilitate energy needs for their team, the irony is that they themselves had battery issues, demanding close to about 300% energy recharge to make up for it. And besides, to collect energy you'd have to waste time picking up the charms, which ultimately slowed down progress. Also, throughout version 2, the Electro element got even more stacked with characters like Yaimiko and Shinobu, who would then later push Electro past battery and more into reactive support with Dendro. In their defense though, while in retrospect it may not seem like that big of an improvement, an attempt was made at giving Electro Traveler a more defined and applicable function. Ostensibly, they were determined to keep going further with that into version 3. Dendro Traveler oversaw a sizable jump in practicality compared to the previous 3. Whether that's because of the element itself offering an impressively high floor, or if it's the character's own properties, for once they were not the worst character of their element. The periodic applications of the burst combined with increasing the active character's elemental mastery, as well as a general damage boost, actually gave them more reasons to be used over the other free Dendro character Kole. In objective relation to all the other characters in Genshin, DMC was and still is a serviceable unit. All the same, most of their early success came as a result of Dendro being a new element and therefore naturally having few options to choose from. As the roster expanded and got more units though, notably once again the Dendro Archon, their market share diminished considerably and they were back to being one of the least used Dendro characters in the game. By this point, you might have noticed I kept repeating a particular point about Aether and Lumine's different elements. They were usable until. A recurring theme of the Traveler's gameplay is that they serve to basically introduce you to the fundamental gameplay motifs of the element. Animo Traveler gives you a primer on crowd control and elemental absorption, two integral components of Animo. Geo Traveler brought you in on Geo Constructs, which at the time was a central theme of Geo before they did away with it. Electro Traveler set you up on Battery, one of the main components of Electro. Dendro Traveler got you involved in elemental mastery, party composition, and persistent application. Thematically, they did a fantastic job at giving you an introductory course on what the element is all about, with the idea that the element's other characters would then dive into more concentrated fields. DMC being a general Dendro character, while Yao Yao and Baitu were sustained, Emily was for burning, Tignati was for quicken, I'll Hate Them was DPS, so on and so forth. There's a reason all variants of Traveler are supportive based. Where things begin to crumble is that they're not the only one whose main purpose is to represent the fundamentals of the element. There's also one other character in each element who does much the same thing, the Archons. The difference is that they represent not just the fundamentals of the element, but narratively and applicably they exist as the paragon of their respective elements, meaning by all measure and all parameters, they totally eclipse Aether and Lumine in every which way imaginable. Having a character who's the literal embodiment of who are you, I'm you but better, makes it next to impossible to design Traveler in a way that makes him strong because the Archon or some other figure of authority in each region will essentially have an identical playstyle to them, only cranked up in power, efficiency and consistency to absolute extremes. The running problem with Traveler was that they didn't have an established identity in each of their elements, and so players had a hard time overlooking the opportunity cost you pay to use them over anyone else. Animo Traveler can group enemies together and absorb elements. Venti can group enemies together and absorb elements, only he does it far better. Geo Traveler can spawn multiple constructs and even buff your carry's DPS a small amount. Zhongli can spawn multiple constructs and buff your carry's DPS a small amount, only he does it far better and can additionally render you indestructible. Electro Traveler can battery your team. Raiden Shogun can battery your team, only she does it far better, can also buff your team's elemental burst damage, can apply Electro more consistently, and can do crazy personal damage herself. Dendro Traveler can apply off-field application, get special buffs according to your party's elemental composition, and even distribute elemental mastery to your party. Guess who else can do that but so much better? Nahida. Beyond that, the vast majority of characters in each element can replicate 90% of what the Traveler is trying to do, but in a way that's either more efficient or consolidated with another role such as healing, shielding, what have you. The problem with Aether and Lumine's first round of elements is that they were generic to a fault, leading them to get outclassed in almost every metric. Hydro Traveler was the first attempt at breaking apart from that cycle. Owing to the Hydro element's multi-purposeness, they sought to make Hydro MC this weird combination of a battle healing attacker, playing into the new theme of Fontaine's HP manipulation with the source water droplets and whatnot. They certainly achieved a visible difference in gameplay between Traveler and Farina in that one's more buffing oriented and the other's more damage based, but a byproduct of this is that they completely forgot to make the character actually good. Hydro Traveler is unanimously considered the worst character in Genshin Impact. There is so much wrong with her kit that entire videos and multi-paragraph long Reddit discussions were made about the sheer disappointment people felt towards them. The Traveler was improving in performance with every new version. The player base theorized that version 4 would be the moment when Traveler would finally be a meta-relevant character, seeing as Hydro has been the best element in Genshin Impact for over 2 years now, which makes the irony all the more painful when of the 6 elements the Traveler has access to, Hydro's their worst one by a substantial margin. They offer 0 offensive or defensive buffs to the party beyond a very tiny amount of healing they can do at C6. They also do basically non-existent damage even if you try to invest into them as a DPS, and their elemental burst is, and I'm not even kidding, an infinitely worse version of Animo Traveler's Gust Surge with Hydro absorption. Rising Waters projects a bubble that travels forward and deals continuous Hydro damage to anything it touches, but since it doesn't actually crowd control enemies, it barely gets to do more than like 2 ticks of damage on account of having moved past enemies by that point. Moreover, it has a massive cooldown of 20 seconds, one of the longest cooldowns in the game, and it doesn't even do that much damage for damaging ultimate. The skill's even more pathetic. It's a visually funny animation. You get to pew 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 bullets of water, but it does practically no damage. You can't move during the channel, which means you can also get interrupted out of it, and no matter how long you hold it for, the cooldown will always be 10 seconds. Typically I try not to say inflammatory statements like X character is trash, but I say with full confidence that Hydro Traveler could be deleted from the game without any announcement, and the player base will be none the wiser to it. They're that insignificant. To make matters worse, they can't even settle for having a unique playstyle. While Farina operates differently from Hydro MC, Big Daddy Novelette comes in and tells the same joke Ether Lumine said a few minutes ago, only everyone laughs when he says it, not them. He essentially is Hydro Traveler, except they remembered to give him quality of life, damage, uptime, consistency, and party agnosticism, and then they added a 3x multiplier to all of them. I am not exaggerating when I say the gap between them is so wide, it would take 10 Hydro Travelers to do the same DPS as one Novelette. Having to contend with the already stacked roster of Hydro was challenge enough for Traveler, let alone a character with the exact same mechanics and attacks as them. All progress up to Dendro Traveler not only evaporated, but they went so far in the other direction to where even Anemo and Geo Traveler are in a better position relative to Hydro Traveler. The failure of Hydro MC had one beneficial consequence though, a renewed interest in discussion over their apparent missed potential. We were 5 travelers in, Anemo, Geo, Electro, Dendro, and Hydro, and not a single one could be considered high tier. At best, Dendro Traveler would be a solid mid-tier, but like I said, as soon as you get your hands on even one other Dendro character like Yao Yao or Nahida or Baitu, reasons to use DMC cascade down to 0. To repeat, it's not obligatory for the tutorial characters to be meta relevant, and Genshin's far from the first game to have an underwhelming MC. Earlier last year though, Honkai Star Rail featured the release of Trailblazer's new Harmony Path, and they were so influential they literally made a new combat archetype, break teams, more specifically super break teams. Around the same time, Wuthering Waves also came out, with both Spectro and Tavik Rover making good first impressions. Despite being entirely different games with different combat engines and mechanics, countless memes and posts were made juxtaposing the game's respective characters, notably comparing the Traveler with Trailblazer. Anticipation, or by this point, desperation for Traveler to be given the same concession began to grow throughout the latter half of 2024, with people hoping that recent circumstances would motivate Hoyo to make the Pyro Traveler the first meta-relevant character. How did that turn out? I'll acknowledge one thing, there was an effort. Pyro Traveler's skill is effectively Xingqiu's ring cutter for Pyro, dealing damage to enemies will launch a follow-up attack once every 3 seconds. Decent damage all things considered, and with a 12-second duration, 18-second cooldown, it's not the worst thing out there. In addition, it's a unique aspect of Pyro we haven't seen before, and being a Night Soul user, they do have access to the Cinder City artifact set. Free character-wise, they're winning out in competition against Kachina for sure. Their Elemental Burst is also a big boom that restores Night Soul points, enabling you to extend the duration of their skill. In contrast to their other Elemental Bursts, this one does noticeably more damage. And that's about it. Now, when you think of Pyro Xingqiu, considering how good Xingqiu is, that might make you excited for Pyro Traveler, but unfortunately it's not as impressive as it sounds. Staggered Pyro application every 3 seconds has very few use cases. It might make for a decent conduit in melt teams, but when it comes to melt, you want a lot of Pyro application so that all cryo attacks get the boost in damage. Secondly, reverse melt teams aren't really the strongest teams in the game to begin with. Beyond that, despite off-field Pyro application being in short supply, especially in the way Pyro MC applies it, established accounts don't really stand to benefit much from what they offer. The ability to run squalls in the city is a positive for sure, but intrinsically they don't have a whole lot. That said, Pyro MC is not without built-in supportive utility. C1 enables them to increase the active character's damage by 6% or their Night Soul user by 15%. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. The rest of their constellations, though, are designed to increase their personal damage. You may have also taken notice that there are 2 components of Traveler's constellations. At the risk of spoilers, when fighting the final boss of Natlan's Archon quest, the Traveler gains bonus effects in line with them being a main DPS. And these are no small amounts either. We're talking 40% bonus attack, 40% bonus pyro damage, 40% pyro shred, 40% damage mitigation, 20% crit rate, 40% crit damage, 40% AoE healing, 4 energy per second, interruption resistance, 20% movement speed. The motherfucker goes Super Saiyan. The caveat is that it only works inside the Natlan weekly boss arena. That's it. I think I speak for most of us when I say it would have been really cool for Pyro Traveler to have those buffs at all times, because then it would make them a veritable high-tier main DPS. Sadly, no cigar. Pyro Traveler, like their previous iterations, is a dire version of the Archon. They both have off-field application, only Mavuika's does way more damage and applies a bit faster, in addition to the massive DPS she can do as a main attacker. But where does Pyro Traveler fall compared to their previous iterations? Depending on who else you have, they're either equal to Dendro Traveler as the best Traveler, or in Natlan teams they're slightly better. But unfortunately, if we look at it in totality, Traveler is once again a mediocre character. Pyro MC doesn't do anything that makes them a necessity, especially if you already have a well-invested Bennett and Xiangling. I'm not implying they do the same thing, I just don't think they're really innovating on the element. Then, if you pulled Mavuika, you literally have no reason to use Pyro Traveler at all. They do so little at base that the extra constellations would be more of a crutch than a luxury. Overall, I would say Pyro MC is only good for brand new players who have basically nothing. They're also not bad if you didn't pull Mavlika, but for everyone else, it's mostly the same as before where they don't really do anything that many characters of their element can't do better, or even if they don't do it in the same way, the end result will ultimately be the same. We're in version 5 and Traveler is still collectively weaker than standard banner 5 stars. Again, after 6 elements, the best we can get out of Pyro Traveler is mid. I'm sorry for bringing up the HSR vs Genshin thing, but it's just too hard to ignore at this point. Harmony Trailblazer was top tier for over half a year, while Remembrance Trailblazer is projected to be around the same level, if not contestably the best character in the game for free-to-plays. They're continuing to balance the character with the same power budget as 1.0 Traveler despite the roster power creeping more and more. Pyro Traveler would honestly be a great character if this was back in version 1, but we're not in version 1 anymore. The bar has been moved up a lot. One more time, I'm sorry for comparing Genshin to other games in this video, but even without HSR, WUA, and ZZZ, it's objectively problematic to see Traveler constantly disappoint us with their dismal capability, especially when they're depicted in the story as characters who can go toe-to-toe with Harbingers, Archons, and even world-ending calamities. The ludonarrative dissonance has begun to get really distracting. Admittedly, I might be overly cynical about Traveler throughout the video. Pyro MC is not bad, let's get that straight, but I can't help but feel like I expected more after 6 elements. Whatever, one last chance in version 6. Preach, just preach. What do you guys think about the Traveler's situation? Do you agree that they should be made stronger, or do you think they're fine as they are? Feel free to share in the comments down below. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my discussions on Zilali and Mavlika if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.